time we talk Super Nintendo. First up, we got Aladdin. Now, I bet a lot of people didn't know there even was a Super Nintendo version of Aladdin, because I think the Sega Genesis version is probably more remembered. First off, Capcom doesn't skimp on the presentation. The levels all look beautiful, the animations are all smooth and detailed, and the music faithfully recreates memorable numbers from the movie, while still having that distinct Capcom sound. This version emphasizes platforming more than straight-up action. It has our hero being more acrobatic, which I feel better suits his character, unlike the Genesis version where Aladdin uses a sword. And honestly, I think this game feels more fun because of its unique emphasis on platforming. It's also more fun because it isn't ridiculous hard like the Genesis version. You actually have a chance of seeing this version to the very end without breaking a couple controllers in frustration. But to be fair, the Genesis version is one of the hardest games worth playing. I'll tell you one thing the Genesis version didn't have: a fucking monkey following you around. Oh my god, the monkey thinks it's people! Yeah, get him, little buddy, get him! Oh god, love that monkey. But now, speaking of the Genesis version, I want to stop my review of Aladdin here, because I just don't feel right talking about this game without directly comparing it to this game. Aladdin is actually a bit of an important game for the Genesis versus Super Nintendo debate. For the most part, the Super Nintendo was the better choice, but there were more than a handful of games where the Genesis arguably won the battle. I feel, to truly do this review justice, I'd have to give equal time to the Genesis version, and I'm not going to do that here. So, I'll leave it at, it's really good, not to mention completely different and easier than the Genesis version. And it's got a lot more than a monkey. Next we're going to the Goof Troop, where we always stick together. Oh fuck you, it's a catchy song. Not the best game of the bunch, but definitely the most unique. In fact, I go as far as to say that it's one of the system's definitive two-player experiences. Goof Troop is a co-op action puzzler that's reminiscent of both Zelda and Halo. You heard me, but allow me to explain. Not only does it just look like Zelda, it's got some pretty tough puzzles and boss fights. There may only be 5 levels, but this is by no means a short or easy game. In fact, those last few levels are fucking enormous. You're not given a map, but there isn't much emphasis on backtracking, so you really don't need one. Now, it's like Halo because Goof Troop has a very similar co-op mechanic. You'll remember that in Halo, during co-op play, you can die as many times as you'd like, just as long as your buddy doesn't die too. If your buddy dies, then you have to fall back and allow them to respawn, so you both get back into the action. And I've always thought the co-op mode was more fun because of this. And this is exactly how Goof Troop plays out. If your buddy dies, you just move to another screen so they can jump back in. And this infinite lives respawn trick is really helpful because outside of the collectible items and objects lying around, you have no form of attack. You will die often. But don't worry, your buddy's got your back. Always sticking together indeed. And that's not all. Teamwork is essential because Goofy and his son Max both have their strengths and weaknesses. Goofy can take out most enemies with just 1 hit, whereas with Max it typically takes 2. But Max runs about twice as fast as his old man. There are some rooms where it's easier to let Max run through and collect items while Goofy works on crowd control. It all adds up to an amazing 2-player experience that sits with Zombies Ate My Neighbors, Turtles in Time, Smash TV, and Wild Guns. The game's biggest flaw? It's nowhere near as fun by yourself. I mean, it's not bad when you're flying solo, but once you've had a taste of that fantastic 2-player mode, it's hard to go back. So, highly recommended, but only if you got somebody to play with. Best of friends forever! And finally, we come to the Magical Quest games starring Mickey Mouse. But there's a lot to go over here, so let's start with a history lesson. The Magical Quest games starring Mickey Mouse aren't based off specific cartoons as much as they are original platformers with some of Disney's most famous characters, like Mickey, Minnie, Pluto, and Pete. The main gimmick of the Magical Quest games were the costumes Mickey and his pals could switch to on the fly. Geez, Capcom, way to take that Mega Man concept for all it's worth. There were 3 games in the series, but things can get pretty confusing. The first one came out on the Super Nintendo in 1992 and was simply called The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse. You might have seen it on the cover of Nintendo Power. It was later ported to the GBA about 10 years later. Hang on here, cause things are gonna get complicated. The second game was released in America as The Great Circus Mystery starring Mickey and Minnie for the Super Nintendo and Genesis in '94. This was the only game in the series to appear on the Genesis. It too was ported to the GBA about 10 years later. However, that version was more appropriately called The Magical Quest 2 starring Mickey and Minnie. This title actually makes a little more sense because only 1 level takes place in a circus. The third and final game in the series, Magical Quest 3 starring Mickey and Donald, was released in '95 on the Japanese Super Famicom. Its only domestic release was on the GBA, again about 10 years later. And the only ones that I own are the Super Nintendo ports of Magical Quest and Circus Mystery, and the GBA port of Part 2. Now, with such a rich history, I'm sure some of you are wondering, why am I talking about these games here and not giving them their own full review? And I thought for a long time about whether or not I should give this series a full video, and I realized that at the end of the day, I don't have much to say about these games. I mean, they're not bad, they're just really not that good. But before I get to all that, let's start with the positive. They all have lush, beautiful, and detailed graphics. I can't vouch for the Genesis, but it's some of the most impressive graphics on the Super Nintendo. Once again, Capcom delivers the goods in the soundtrack department with tracks that aren't exactly memorable, but solid nonetheless. The overall presentation is imaginative, giving it a very light-hearted and warm aesthetic. I'm sure that Uncle Walt will be proud. But as you can guess, I had a couple gripes. The levels are all big and sprawling, creating the illusion that there's lots to explore, but there really isn't. These are actually extremely linear games, with very little emphasis on exploration, and absolutely no emphasis on backtracking. I mean, there are hidden items to find, but it really doesn't matter. You see, the biggest problem with these games is they're boring. For example, each boss fight is a chore, because everyone takes like 1,000,000 hits to kill. I recalled saying, "Oh my god, would you just die already?" more than a few times playing through these games. I mean, it was a problem I had with Darkwing Duck, but it's an issue here. The bosses take far too many hits to kill, and you take far too few. Take the very first boss you fight in Circus Mystery. He's crazy easy, but takes 8 goddamn hits to kill. And then look at this. Is this not the most pathetic boss fight ever? I don't even have to move. But then again, these games can be surprisingly hard, especially Part 1. Like, take this spider boss from Part 1. You gotta jump on him just perfect. And this Bionic Commando grappling hook thing is surprisingly hard to use. How could Capcom, the creators of Bionic Commando, make this part so difficult? Take these flying squirrels, for example. They're so unpredictable, it's almost impossible not to get hit by them because Mickey moves so slow. And that brings us back to my original point. These games just move at a snail's pace. Without a dash button, you're just praying for a hill you can stroll down to pick up the pace a little. Once again, the colors and animations are all beautiful, but that doesn't stop these games from being boring. But then again, because Mickey moves so slowly, it can be tough to move out of harm's way, resulting in a lot of cheap hits and deaths. I don't know, maybe I've played too much Little Nemo, but anytime these games gave me any real challenge, it was because of some cheap random enemy or because the boss fights just took forever. But I'm aware that I'm raining on people's childhoods here, so let me be clear. These are good games. They're all still really solid. And I'm sure my opinion of them would be different if I had played them as a kid, but since I have no nostalgic connection to these games, I have to be critical and honest. They really don't impress me much. I will confess I've never played the third one, but all the reviews I've read make it clear that it's par for the course and probably something I wouldn't enjoy. And this brings us to the end. Like I said earlier, I don't own all the Disney Capcom games. I'm only reviewing what I own, but this really was most of them. Capcom would continue making games for Disney over the years, but they became few and far between. Not to mention kinda shitty. So, where are they now? Disney actually had a ton of great games based off their cartoons. Virgin made a number of quality titles like The Lion King, The Jungle Book, and of course the Genesis version of Aladdin. Sega made a bunch of games for the Genesis, with Castle of Illusion, World of Illusion, and Fantasia. The two Illusion games are phenomenal. Fantasia, on the other hand, is fucking garbage. And then there's Quackshot, all the different versions of Mickey Mania, Rare's Mickey Speedway, the list goes on. And then of course there's the immensely popular Kingdom Hearts games. I myself am not a huge fan, but the series' enormous fanbase is undeniable. Capcom would continue milking Mega Man, Street Fighter, and Resident Evil for all it's worth, while making new franchises to milk, like Onimusha and Devil May Cry. That said, they still remain a driving force of creativity in gaming, releasing many commercially unsuccessful yet critically popular games like Beautiful Joe, Okami, Killer 7, Maximo, and Zack and Wiki. And Capcom would continue its streak of great licensed games, with titles like Little Nemo the Dream Master, the arcade and Nintendo version of Willow, the Dungeons & Dragons arcade games, and the phenomenal series of the Marvel fighting games, X-Men Children of the Atom, Street Fighter vs. X-Men, and the two Marvel vs. Capcom games, the second being one of the craziest, most ridiculous, and popular fighting games of all time. But before I wrap things up, let us not forget that there are a ton of great licensed games out there. GoldenEye, Chronicles of Riddick, Ghost in the Shell for the PlayStation, Astro Boy for the GBA, King Kong, Beetle Adventure Racing, The Warriors, the Rainbow Six series, Bucky O'Hare, Monster House for the GBA, a handful of TMNT and Tiny Toon games, the 2 PS2 Rocky games, the Genesis version of Dick Tracy, who knows how many Star Wars games, and not to mention recent titles like the LEGO games, Ghostbusters, or Batman Arkham Asylum. I could go on, but the point is, there are way too many great licensed games out there to be so fucking angry all the time. Cheers. Ah.